6 decades of superior service. 6 decades of humanitarian assistance. 6 decades of providing leadership on a world stage. For 6 decades, World Airways has been a pioneer and an innovator in global passenger charter and air cargo service. From its humble beginnings in the post-war era, the company has played a significant role in both the business and history of the latter part of the 20th century. Incorporated on March 29, 1948, World Airways was established by Benjamin Pepper and J. Stewart Robertson, flying passenger routes between New York and San Juan, Puerto Rico. The company's founders were able to turn war surplus aircraft into a viable business with a fleet of 3 Boeing 314 Clippers. One of these was the famous Dixie Clipper, the aircraft that carried President Franklin D. Roosevelt to the Casablanca Conference with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin in 1943. The optimistic wave that ushered in the 1950s also rolled through World Airways as visionary entrepreneur Edward Daly purchased the fledgling airline for a mere $50,000. One of Daly's first moves was to update the airline's fleet by leasing Douglas DC-4s. Daly also established his first government contract with the military, a relationship that would prove to be one of the company's most profitable and rewarding assets. In 1951, World Airways was able to provide supplemental airlift to the U.S. military in Korea. Operating in an era that saw the closing of the Iron Curtain, slamming shut borders all across the Eastern European frontier, World Airways established another tradition that would characterize the company for years to come. In 1956, following the failure of the Hungarian Revolution, World Airways flew humanitarian missions to airlift fleeing refugees from Europe to the United States. Having proved its ability to provide superior air transport to various locales in times of conflict, the company received the contract to provide military air transport service to U.S. troops in the Western Pacific. The 1960s welcomed in the jet age, with acquisitions of Boeing 707s, 727s, and later DC-8s, for World Airways' biggest role to date on the world stage, the war in Vietnam. Thousands of tons of material and personnel were flown across the Pacific from World's newly established headquarters in Oakland, California, in support of the military conflict. No other airline was able to provide the same level of aid and support. Therefore, as conditions on the ground started to deteriorate in March of 1975, it was World Airways alone that provided a literal lifeline to the most vulnerable of the war's victims. Ed Daly had already supervised the evacuation of hundreds of war refugees from Da Nang to Saigon, having survived the perilous last flight from Da Nang.
In South Vietnam, Da Nang has become a Dunkirk, with one crucial difference. Unlike Dunkirk in World War II, Da Nang is stricken with rampant panic. As the enemy approaches, the panic has swept from the coastal city's crowded back streets and pagodas onto runways at the airport. Ed Daly, president of World Airways, has been flying refugees to Saigon. But today, the government and the U.S. Embassy refuse to guarantee airport security because of mobs rushing the planes. Despite that, Daly flew in today to pick up women and children. CBS News correspondent Bruce Dunning was among the last of the Americans to leave Da Nang late this week, but he went back aboard Daly's plane today to witness what was supposed to have been a mission of mercy. Here is Dunning's exclusive film report on the tragic results.
Reports from Saigon said thousands of people were roaming Da Nang airfield. But as the plane landed, this did not at first seem evident. But then people poured from behind buildings and revetments, racing on cars, jeeps, trucks, Hondas, and on foot, desperate to get the plane and make sure they got on before anyone else.
One guy got on.
As soon as the rear stairway was lowered, the stampede of terrorized people tried to storm the plane. From the cockpit, the pilots reported by radio that the situation was out of control. Several times the pilots moved the plane, hoping to break the crowds around the rear ladder. There was no control. High-ranking officers in Da Nang have fled, leaving soldiers and airmen to fend for themselves. The hordes tried to jam up the stairway as Daley himself tried to block the stairs. As men clambered over one another, pushing aside women and children in their panic-stricken fury, members of the air crew dragged them onto the plane, trying to fill it as fast as possible. The tension and panic intensified. The heavily armed men were menacing. They left their wives, their children, their aged parents on the runway while they forced their own way on board, a rabble of young enlisted men. CBS News cameraman Mike Marriott and soundman Van Duck dared not leave the plane, aware they might not be able to get back on. One newsman was left behind as the crowd pushed him out of reach of the plane. The stewardesses dragged people on and rushed them to seats, screaming all the while, "Where are the women and children?" They piled 4, 5, and 6 men into seats intended for 3. Finally, there was room for no more. The plane began to move as people still clambered up the ladder. Angry men left behind fired pistols and automatic weapons at the plane, determined that no one would go if they couldn't. A grenade went off under one wing, damaging it. Unable to move on the blockaded runway, the plane raced down the taxiway, swerving to avoid abandoned vehicles, perhaps even running over people. As the plane strained laboriously into the air, people were still clinging to the wheels and the rear stairs. 7 men fell off as the plane reached heights of 1,000 feet or more. As the plane reached 6,000 feet, 1 man was still stuck in the ladder. Daley had to climb out and pull him back as the plane swerved and shuddered under its heavy load. As calm fell on the smug men who had managed to fight off their friends and relatives to get on, the hard-working cabin crew took account. 268 people were on board, among them 5 women and 2 or 3 small children. The rest were some of the men whom President Thieu said would defend Da Nang. They had no apparent feelings about leaving others behind, only gratitude that World Airways had saved their lives, with a flight that Ed Daley intended for refugee women and children. Once in flight at low altitude, because the damaged rear stairway wouldn't close, the pilots assessed the damage to the plane. Bullets had damaged gas lines and the plane was losing fuel. The pilots were not sure the wheels would function on landing because people had attempted to hide in the wheel wells. The flight from Da Nang to Saigon normally takes about 50 minutes. This one took more than an hour and a half. Another World Airways plane flew alongside, trying to assess the damage, and reported that the cargo hatches were open and full of people.
Do you think the nose gear will come down, or you can't tell yet? Can't tell. I don't want to check it till we get in closer. That's the biggest problem I see at the moment here. Long 945 clear to Saigon. Something hanging down in the gear, my gear doors. It may be a body. Did you say a body? Well, I can't tell. It sure looks like it. Could be. We had them climbing all over him.
One man on the escort plane said that crew was praying for us on the damaged plane. Not knowing whether the wheel assemblies would hold, the flight crew put the plane, almost empty of fuel, down very gingerly on the runway at Saigon, and the deserters on board cheered. As the plane taxied to a parking place, soldiers poured out of the luggage holds. As cameraman Marriott was filming the unloading, a South Vietnamese Air Force security officer arrested him for taking these pictures. The Air Force had things under control again. But the men and women of World Airways had brought their plane and its load home. Bruce Denning, CBS News, back from Da Nang.